When I first started to grow fruit trees in my local park, I heard about the importance of growing hardy apple trees. I wasn't exactly sure what that meant. I guessed it meant that the trees would be tough and could put up with a lot, and I was sort of right. Traditionally, when you say an apple tree is hardy, it means that it's winter hardy and that it can survive a cold winter. And I live in Canada, so a winter hardy apple tree would be a great choice for me. But over the years, hardy has come to mean more than a tree's ability to survive cold winters. It can also mean that the tree is easier to grow because it's resistant to common fruit tree diseases. Or it might mean that the tree is better equipped to handle extreme temperature fluctuations, those that come with the changing climate. So in today's show, we're going to talk about hardy apple trees with Bob Obsborne, who's the owner of Cornhill Nursery in New Brunswick and the author of a beautiful new hardcover book, Hardy Apples, Growing Apples in Cold Climates. Before we dig into today's topic, I would love to hear from you. Do you grow hardy apple trees? What are your favorite apple varieties? Send your question or your comment during the live show today, and we'll enter you into our contest to win a free copy of Bob's book, which sells in the stores for $35. So to enter today's contest, just send us an email right now to instudio101@gmail.com. That's instudio101@gmail.com. Send it at any time during the live show, and remember to include your first name and where you're writing from. I hope to hear from you soon. So, Bob Obsborne, welcome to the show today.
Thank you. Good to be here, Susan.
It's great to have you. Now, your book is about hardy apple trees. Why have you become an expert in hardy apple trees? What is the climate like where you live?
Well, in New Brunswick, we can go down to -40, which is the same whether you're Celsius or Fahrenheit. It's where they cross. And that puts a lot of apples out of our reach. Now, it is true that we are a bit warmer the last few decades, but we can still easily get -35. So they have to be tough enough to survive that, which means they have to go into dormancy relatively early and be able to stay in dormancy until the actual spring arrives. Because one of the problems with our particular climate is that we can be -20 and then the next day or two, it'll rise up above freezing, sometimes even staying there for a while, and then bang, we're back to -20. That is very difficult for some plants, especially some fruit trees, to manage. So it has to be something that is adaptable to this kind of climate. Now, when you're looking out Midwest and so forth, you have maybe even lower temperatures, maybe not as much fluctuation, but you're still going to need extremely hardy apples. So disease resistance is part of that, but it's actually a fairly minor part in terms of why we call them hardy. What we're looking for are apples that will survive very, very low temperatures and still produce fruit.
I find it interesting you talk about going into dormancy early. What exactly does that look like?
You can tell a lot by how when the leaves drop. For instance, if you have a maple tree that's in Tennessee, it's been acclimated there, it really doesn't go into dormancy till later than one that would be in New Brunswick or Maine or places like that. So a lot of it has to do with shutting down early, which is generally around November. So all of my trees, for instance, have lost their leaves now. They're completely bare. If you have a tree that's still hanging onto its leaves, chances are it is not fully dormant. And once a tree goes into full dormancy, you don't want to have to bring it out of dormancy because it will never go back into as deep a dormancy. So it has to have that ability to resist coming out of dormancy if you have a warm period in midwinter.
So my other question is, are there actually hardy, quote unquote, apple trees that traditionally were grown in climates like in Canada, which you now won't grow because of the fluctuations in the climate. Can you think of any cultivars?
Not too many. I think, although we do get more fluctuations than it may cause problems, it hasn't really caused a problem with hardy apples that we have. And that would be for Ontario and even Midwest and so forth, or prairie provinces. So I can't think of too many that are really affected that much yet. Now that may change in the future, but really, if it's hardy, it should stay hardy, even with these fluctuations we're getting.
So I got an email here from Gail, and Gail says she is very glad that you're on the show with me, and she's welcoming you. She says, stay well. So thank you very much, Gail. Okay, the other questions I have for you is about the history of hardy apple trees. How is it that we have them? Were they sort of brought over from Europe? When did hardy apple trees begin here in North America?
Well, the story goes all the way back to southern Kazakhstan, which is in Asia, Central Asia. And it was there that the original home of the apple was discovered by a Russian botanist. And it was right on what we call the Silk Road. So there were apple seed, especially traveling both east toward China and west toward Central Asia and then Persia. They made their way eventually to Europe and then eventually crossed the ocean, mostly as seed to begin with, into North America. And then once you get into North America, there's a wide range of climate and temperature. So the ones that could not stand the cold temperatures, of course, either died out in the north or, you have this adaptation problem where, you can, if you're lucky, the seed germinates. If you're lucky, it grows up and doesn't get eaten and so forth. And so, it takes a while before you know whether a particular seedling is worth growing. And now a lot of them were grown for cider, so that was a different thing. It didn't really matter too much whether or not it was a dessert type or a cooking type. But it took quite a while before some of these began to be selected. And so then you start getting the early ones like Seek No Further, let's see, Fameuse and so forth, some of these really early types. And then later on, there was an influx of genetics brought from the colder areas of Russia into North America. And then you have cultivars such as Duchess, Titovsky, Antonovka, some of these really, really tough things that can take -40, -45, and still bear fruit the next year. And so they use those in breeding programs. So what's happening is over the last few centuries, we have seen an expansion of the number of apple trees that you can grow in cold climates. So it's been quite remarkable, actually. And now we're seeing even higher quality apples being produced that can grow in very, very northern conditions. So it's been a long process.
It has been. It really sounds like it. We have an email from Joyce here. Hello to Susan. When picking apples in the fall, what is the very best way to store them to last most of the winter, if that is in fact possible? Thank you for the tips.
What I would say is it depends a lot on the apple, how you handle it. If you have early apples, they're not going to keep very long as a general rule. But if you have a later hardy keeping type apple, generally speaking, you want to get that apple into about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius as soon as possible. And that prevents it from breaking down. Some apples, for instance, Honeycrisp is a very popular apple right now. And Honeycrisp actually needs to sit at a temperature of around 10 degrees for 3, 4, 5 days before it is put into the lower temperature. So it does vary slightly, but in most cases, once you pick it, if you can get it down to those kind of temperatures, let's say 3, 4 degrees Celsius, you should be able to keep those for months, perhaps even several months, six. Some apples can keep even longer if they are given special treatment. Now we have the cold storages today are replacing oxygen, for instance, in the rooms. They're sealed rooms, and they replace that with nitrogen. So they can actually almost completely stop the respiration in an apple, and it'll keep often maybe even a year in cold storage and still be in good condition. So it's the science of keeping them has changed, but most people don't have that, of course. So you just keep it as cold as possible without freezing it.
I think Joyce's question is a great one, because in terms of hardy apples, you're going to be planting an apple tree. Let's say somebody who's listening to the show and they choose a cultivar. There are actually some cultivars that will keep better than others. So would you say that there are one or two cultivars that you might suggest that are good keepers, that if you're planting a few apple trees, you want to know you have one that will make it through the winter in a regular cold cellar or fridge even?
One of the apples that I'm most interested in is called Liberty. It's a new scab-resistant cultivar, comes out of New York. It's a late apple, so we don't pick them here till mid-October. And if that's put into cold storage, you can keep that right until probably next June, if you can keep the temperature down. There are, like even Honeycrisp, for instance, is an excellent keeper. A lot of, usually if it's a late apple, a hard apple, if you give it the proper conditions, you can keep them for 6 months or more.
And by the way, to Joyce and anybody else who is interested, go to orchardpeople.com and you can search for an article we have on how to store apples during the winter. So that will also talk to you, explain some of the technicalities of how to keep an apple tree at home. Okay, we've got a message here. Oh, this is interesting. A message from Jeff. I don't know where Jeff is from. Hi, Susan Poisner and Bob Obsborne. How do fruiting wall or espalier pruning methods affect fruit trees, especially those that are borderline hardy?
Well, it's true that in the past, especially, espalier against like a southern wall of a building, especially if it's a heated building, will give a little bit of extra warmth in the winter. So you can actually oftentimes get them to ripen early and perhaps make them survive winters that they wouldn't out in the open. You're still taking a chance when you do that, because one of the things that happens if it's a southern wall, which is what most people are using, is that it will heat up on a sunny day and so forth, and then you get a quick freeze when the sun sets. So that is a problem too. Now, espalier that is used today to essentially create high density orchards, it's essentially what you're doing is you when you first put your tree in, you train the central leader up to the top wire, which is usually around 9 feet in most operations. And then as the side branches grow, you gradually remove any branch that gets half the diameter of the trunk or more. And so you're always preferring horizontal type branches that are less vigorous. And so you're always taking away vigor from the tree, but you're increasing the amount of fruit buds that are formed. And so what you do is you actually promote high production in a sort of wall of branches, because it's almost like a 2-dimensional tree rather than a 3-dimensional tree. And usually that means that they ripen earlier. You tend to get larger fruit and hopefully better quality.
Okay, yeah, interesting question, because really that's a curious question, because you do have to carefully choose what types of trees that you grow in espalier, like a decorative espalier, versus high density trees. Like maybe some are better than others in terms of some are tip bearing and some are spur bearing. So it's interesting. In your book, you do talk a lot about the shapes. Different trees naturally want to go into different shapes. You do mention that, I think. Yeah, we have another email here from Debbie. This is also interesting. So Debbie writes, hello, Urban Forestry. My name is Debbie, and I live at 7,600 feet on a south-facing slope in the Colorado foothills outside of Boulder, Colorado. I'm growing 2 apple varieties, Frostfire. Unfortunately, on a dwarfing rootstock, not a good idea in a dry, windy climate. And Debbie is also growing Colorado Orange on standard rootstock. That's an heirloom apple variety from the Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project. Oh, Colorado Orange, that's interesting. Both varieties are doing well with only strategic watering during very dry periods. Thanks so much for your show. Wow, what an interesting email. Have you heard of Frostfire, the apple variety Frostfire, Bob?
I have not heard of Frostfire. There is a Frostbite, which is is my favorite, I think, and it is coming out of. That came out of Minnesota. It was produced quite early, actually, back in the 1930s, I think, but I've never heard of Colorado Orange. It's probably a very local apple, but fascinating.
Yes, it is. It actually is. Here's another email. This one's from Sean. Sean, not sure where you're from. Hi, Susan. Thanks for the info on the storage of apples. So helpful. Wonderful. Okay, so let's talk about hardy apples that are hardy, but that are also easy to grow. Are there some apple varieties that you feature in your book that you would say are easier to grow than others?
Yes. One of the things that I think frustrates most people when they start to grow apples, no matter where you are, is disease and insects. And so if you are planning to grow without the heavier duty pesticides and so forth, then the first thing I would look for, other than hardiness, is disease resistance. And diseases are probably the most difficult to deal with because they're airborne spores that land. And yet the most famous, of course, is apple scab. So you take a cultivar like Macintosh, very, very susceptible. Now you can take a cultivar such as NovaMac, which is a cross between Macintosh and a scab-resistant seedling that resulted in an apple that's essentially the same flavor as Macintosh, the same texture, very, very similar. A little bit later, but not much. And you can grow that with ease because it does not get scab, it does not get mildew, it does not get rust, it does not get fire blight. So you'll still have to deal with some insects, but even so, I find that NovaMac, for instance, is more resistant to things like codling moth and apple maggot than many. Another one that I would point out is Liberty, which again, very, very disease resistant. So that makes growing them so much easier than if you have a scabby apple. And most of your common cultivars are subject to scab.
Mm-hmm.
And scab, it's not that you can't eat it. It's not going to harm you, but it aesthetically is not as pleasing, and they will not store as well. They will tend to rot easily in storage. So very important that you look at the disease resistance as well as the hardiness.
So we have Liberty, we have NovaMac. Is there a third one that you find easier to grow, disease resistant, that you really like?
Oh, well, we can go back to Frostbite, which is all around the most interesting apple I've ever run into. When I first bit into a Frostbite, it was as if all of the essences of apple had been distilled, almost like a wine compared to a brandy, right? And it has this background of kind of sugarcane sweetness. It's very crunchy, juicy. Some people say it has a sort of nuttiness to it. It's a very complex apple. And interesting enough, when they did a DNA test of Honeycrisp, the big superstar right now, it turns out that it is the grandparent of Honeycrisp. And when you taste it, you can feel some of that, like that crisp, crackling crispness of it. But the flavor is like nothing else. And it
That
does tend,
sounds
I have not seen much scab on it at all. And it is super hardy.
that sounds fantastic. I have never had frostbite. I would love to try it. Do you know who developed it, or was it a seedling apple that somebody found?
It came out of the University of Minnesota fruit breeding program. I think it was Dr. Alderman who chose the seedling. They used it in for breeding purposes, but it was never released because it was small. It was not what we call pretty. It often had russeting on the surface and so forth, and not a large apple. But it's interesting that there were enough people like me who bought it as Minnesota 447 who fell in love with it, and they kept badgering the university until finally they had a contest to name it. And they had 7,000 people write in with names, and I think it was 4 or 7 of them chose Frostbite, which I think is an absolutely perfect name. And so it's just so great that it was not allowed to slip into horticultural oblivion because it is such an amazing apple.
Oh, that's a great story. We got another email from Jeff who tells us he's from Rapid City, South Dakota. So thank you, Jeff. Okay, let's see. We've got a couple more emails. Debbie writes us again. Oh, so Debbie was talking about the Frostbite apple variety. Thanks for the correction, Debbie says. That's great. Okay. Oh, I really have to try Frostbite. And it's not something that I have ever seen in a supermarket or in a farmer's market even. So I guess I have to come to New Brunswick to try it at some point. Rita writes, okay, hello, Susan from Boston, Massachusetts. Love the show today. No question right now, but please enter me into the book contest. Thank you. I think everybody's quite excited about your book, which is really beautiful. Lots of pictures. Did you have a lot of fun tasting the different cultivars, or is this just from years and years of experience working with the trees?
Well, I've been at this for 42 years, not counting when I grew some apples before my old home. And so I've been able to taste 150 different types of apples over the years. And there's always new ones coming in. For instance, this was the first year that I had Pristine, which is a new scab resistant cultivar that's very early, but keeps well. And it is amazing. It's like one of the best early apples I've ever had. And so it always keeps it new. It keeps it exciting. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book was that people don't get a chance to try a Frostbite or a Pristine and so forth. You have let's say the top 10 apples in the store, and they all have to look gorgeous. They have to be large. And it's not that they aren't good apples. I mean, Ambrosia, these are wonderful apples. But there is so much that we have kind of relegated to the dustbin of horticulture because they are not as productive. Perhaps they are small. They don't look as pretty as people think. Now that is changing. I have noticed that all of a sudden now you have green apples appearing in the store and so forth. But there's really very little chance of finding a lot of these unless you know a farmer who produces these and sells them at a market or something. But it's another good reason to go to farmers markets, because you often see apples like a Sandow, for instance, which kind of disappeared. Came out of the 1950s, and it's an amazing apple, very scab resistant, and yet hardly anybody knows about it. So
Yeah, absolutely. And another good reason to learn to grow fruit trees yourself, right? If a lot of these cultivars, if you don't grow them, if you don't know someone who grows them, you will never get to enjoy them. And by the way, Pristine is one of my very favorites. It is a wonderfully early apple, and we have it in our orchard. The great thing about Pristine for us is in our orchard, which is in a public park, people walk through and harvest the apples early because they're around on the tree for the whole season and they're excited, and they harvest the apples before they're even ripe. So we often don't get to taste them, but the Pristine is so early, nobody even expects it. So we have this tree kind of hidden away, and then we have managed to get 1 or 2 apples off of the tree. But each year there are people who figure things out, and they get the apples. That's okay. Let's do one more quick question before we have our little commercial break. I had a bunch of wonderful questions from Ariel in Utah, who submitted them over Facebook. And one of her questions was, what is the best red-fleshed hardy apple? Well, can you talk a little bit about red-fleshed apples? You don't really get those in the supermarket much.
No, there aren't too many out there, although now they're doing breeding work right now to produce them because they're very high in anthocyanin, which is a very healthy thing to eat. And that's what you get in the red flesh and so forth. There is one called Geneva crab, which is used a lot in cider now. It gives color to the juice. And it's a little on the tart side, but it's quite good. There are others. I have one called Tango wine, where they're not exactly completely red flesh, but you have all the veins moving in from the skin into the interior. Another one that will do that is actually Fameuse or snow apple. It's white flesh, but you have veins running into it. But there are not too many apples out there in the market right now with red flesh, but I think you're going to see them. There's an old one called Surprise, which, but that's a very old and probably almost extinct apple now. But there are a few around, but not very many.
Interesting. Yes. And especially if you're growing for hardy, if you've got cold conditions, that's going to limit it even more. You feature 90 different hardy apple tree cultivars, and you call them specifically cultivars, not varieties. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, apples have always been called by a variety. And yet botanically or horticulturally, that is not correct, because a variety is a group of similar seedlings that are very difficult to tell apart, but they are genetically different. For instance, if you take a green arrow pea, for instance, well, all of those plants will look the same. They'll produce the same general type of fruit, but they are all genetically unique. So they're not really exactly the same. When we talk about a cultivar, we are talking about a specific seedling that was found, named, and then is propagated asexually. So it's either by cuttings or by grafting or budding. And so what it does is it maintains the exact DNA, if you will, the genetic makeup of that plant. And so, if you're looking at a Macintosh, for instance, it's within reason, it is exactly the same as the seedling that was found back in the 1700s in Ontario. So when we're talking about cultivar, we are talking about a unique set of genetics.
Okay, so let's talk about some different cultivars. We have an email from Carrie. Carrie is from Bend, Oregon. Are there any dwarf varieties of apple trees that produce well in drier climates? We've had them in the ground for about 5 years, and the blossoms usually freeze. One of the varieties is Pixie Crunch, and I don't remember the other variety. So that's from Carrie.
Well, if your blossoms are freezing, it has a lot to do with your site. And if you'll notice that most commercial operations are located where you have no late freezes and no early freezes in the fall. So they're often next to large bodies of water or in a particular situation that gives you that freedom from frost. And that's a very difficult thing to stop. Now, most cultivars of apple are relatively vigorous or moderately vigorous. And it is actually the rootstock that they are grafted or budded onto that is going to affect the size and often the earliness of production, and sometimes even the amount of production. So really it's the rootstock that is giving you the dwarfing ability. And it's not so much that it doesn't strangle the tree or anything. What it does is it promotes a very early production of fruit, which means you have a lot of seed, and seed is what takes most of the energy of a tree to produce. So when you have a dwarfing rootstock, a lot of your energy is going into fruit production rather than vegetative. So it tends to stay smaller. I have not had a lot of experience with living in a dry climate, because ours is, if anything, is a fairly humid climate here. And so I'm a little bit out of my element when I talk about the dryness. But most fruit trees, particularly apples, do require the soil to be able to hold enough moisture for proper growth. And so you may have to find that you need to provide some sort of irrigation. And I would highly recommend something like a drip irrigation if it's not a big orchard, just to have a few fruit trees, because you're going to use a lot less water, and it'll be directed right where you need it to the root system. So having a lack of water is a real problem if you're trying to grow apples, no matter whether they're hardy or not. So that's something that has to be looked at.
Carrie wrote us back actually quickly after that. So she mentioned that the climate is very dry with only 12 inches of precipitation a year. The temperature swings can be between 30 and minus 40, 30 degrees and minus 40. The first winter trees were in the yard. We had a very snowy and cold winter. But here's her extra question, and this is a nice one, a good question. Also, should fruit trees be watered in the winter months?
Generally, we would not. Again, but it depends on your situation. But I would say it's very unusual that anybody would water them when they're dormant, because they are not transpiring. They're not losing water through their leaves. So as long as there's adequate moisture in the ground for the roots to survive well, I would not generally suggest watering in the winter.
We have an email as well from Mark. Mark writes, "Hello, Susan. What do you think of Sweet 16, which also comes from Minnesota?" And Mark is writing from Greenwich, UT. Is that Utah?
Utah, I believe.
Yeah, Utah. So Sweet 16.
Yeah. Sweet 16 is another Minnesota apple. And there's another one besides that called Keepsake, which is actually a seedling from Frostbite. And Sweet 16 it's a lovely apple. We have some young trees here. Actually, Minnesota has produced some of the finest hardy apples that we have today. Yeah, I would advise people, sometimes they're very hard to get outside of Minnesota. You can find a lot of the Minnesota apples there, but outside of Minnesota, you really have to search and for places that sell such unique cultivars.
Actually, I know that here in Ontario, we have Silver Creek Nursery and Whiffletree both sell Sweet 16. Mm-hmm. I've planted them for community groups on various sites, never managed to get an apple to taste just because I don't always go back. But they are disease resistant. So I'm kind of excited about Sweet 16. If anybody's listening from Ontario and you've got a harvest, tell me, and I would love to grab one of those apples to taste. We've got an interesting email here from Sean. Let's see. So, hello, Susan. Thank you for taking the time to make your podcast. I'm happy to have found this resource. I started growing small fruit trees in 2014, and it has been a challenge. I live in Newfoundland, and the climate is often cool, cold, and damp. I'm listening to the older podcasts and was wondering if you can make the earlier ones available. Oh, wow, great. There's more to this question, but on that, Sean, at orchardpeople.com/podcasts, you can listen to the last 25 episodes, but I have many more. In order to access those, you can go to Apple iTunes. But I'm going to put a link on that website to take you, Sean, and anybody else to another website where you can get every single old episode. So you can listen to them because all my guests are so fantastic. It's always worth listening back. Anyways, Sean says, the current topic is very interesting and timely, not just the time of year, but helping guide my selections. I do have a question for your guest. Is selecting rootstock the biggest consideration for colder climates, or can variety be just as important? Great question, Sean. What are your thoughts?
They're both important. You definitely want to choose a hardy rootstock and one that will be compatible with the cultivar you choose. But although Newfoundland is cold, it's not near as cold as we are, unless you are very inland, because the ocean does have a tempering effect on the temperature. But what I would suggest, and we've supplied growers, orchardists in Newfoundland before, is to choose early cultivars, early ripening, because a lot of the late ripening cultivars need a certain amount of heat units before they will be really at their peak. So cultivars like Viking, Red Free, Williams Red, some of those are excellent. Pristine is another one I would very much like to see tried in Newfoundland. And you will have a lot better luck using those early cultivars, because they're going to actually, because you're maybe not as cold in the winter, but you're cooler all summer. And so you don't have the heat units that we would have here. So with that in mind, even though it's what we call an early cultivar, it's going to probably mature about the time just before your first frosts. And so I think you'll be successful with those early ones. A lot of the later ones, don't try to grow Delicious or some of these late types, because you're not going to have much luck.
Great advice. Great question too. So here we have a question from Aislinn. Let's see. Hi, Susan and Bob. Just wondering if you have any info on disease resistance of red wonder apple, specifically fire blight resistant. I'm in Eastern Ontario, Zone 4B. Also, is it yummy? So thanks, love the show. That's from Aislinn. Red wonder apple is not one that I've heard of before. What about you, Bob?
I have never heard of it either. And
wow.
I've heard of a lot of apples, but not red wonder. It might be a very new one, possibly. But no, that's one I've never heard of.
Oh, Aislinn, well, you're going to have to keep us posted on that and send me a red. I want to try one of those. Every new apple I want to try. That's a little bit greedy of me. But anyways, we've got an email from John. Okay. John writes, hi, Susan. Thanks for the great presentation and knowledgeable guest. I'm wondering, in view of the fact that we're all in the midst of a climate crisis, that amongst other things stems from the decline in our biodiversity, should we be trying to plant native apple trees that will not only produce apples, but provide habitat and a food supply for native insects and fauna? Thanks. And that's from John, who is in Aurora, and he is from the Canadian Tree Fund.
Well, I'm very much a diversity guy. I think it's very important. However, when we look at apples, there were only a few native apple species here. They're extremely rare, and they were tiny fruited and very bitter. So they have never been used, to my knowledge, in any orchard. And I think they would be extremely difficult to find. But because really all of the apples, actually most of the fruit trees we grow, have all been brought from somewhere else. They do, however, provide, like an apple tree provides pollen and nectar and so forth for bees, wild bees, as well as honeybees. And in some respects, I guess you could say it feeds the native fauna as well, but we don't really enjoy that in our orchards because the deer love them and the maggot loves them and so forth. But in terms of natives, there's not really much to choose from when you're talking about apples.
So I have a couple of comments as well for you, John, and I love your question. First of all, check back to a previous episode of the show where we did an episode on native apple trees. We talk about them, what they are, what they taste like, what diseases they get or don't get. I think you'll enjoy that. But the other thing is, we have a previous episode on pruning old apple trees. The guest was from England, from the UK. And what he was saying is old apple trees that are big old apple trees that are grown on full-size rootstock that will live to 100 years or more. Those trees are really important for sustaining, native, whether it's insects or wildlife. When they're starting to break down, when they have holes in them, when they're falling apart. So we so often here in North America grow dwarfing apple trees that maybe won't live to 100 years. So there are different ways to provide habitat, and one is keeping those old apple trees healthy and alive with correct pruning, with correct care. Just because it's old and it's not producing a lot of fruit doesn't mean that it's not giving us a benefit, environmentally and in every other way. And plus, a lot of old apple trees, people complain, oh, it's not producing well. If you prune it properly and take care of it properly, it will still produce, and it can be an old friend. So those are my thoughts. Now I'll get off my little platform there. But yes, what a wonderful question. So Bob, when it comes to heirloom apples, hardy heirloom apples, there are so many cultivars. I went to one apple tasting a few years ago with 40 different cultivars to try. You literally cannot try 40 different apples and retain your sense of taste. You have to pick 6 or something and try. So if I was going to plant an heirloom apple tree, and out of the selection of God knows how many, what would you say would be the best tasting heirloom apple tree that is hardy that I could buy for a fresh eating apple?
Well, one that you probably could find at least the nursery that provides any kind of selection is the old fameuse or snow apple. If it's brought to maturity, it's usually bright red, especially if it's in the sun. It is small to medium, usually around medium size, although sometimes you get large ones. And inside is a flavor it is reminiscent of McIntosh, but it's extremely aromatic. It has very high sugars, especially if it's completely ripe. For me, it's one of the great flavors of the old apples. I have one that's hard to get now called Seek No Further, which I think is one of the greatest names in apples. It's like, this is the one, you don't have to worry about it anymore. And it was actually one of the oldest apples in North America. It's found in the Connecticut River Valley in about 1640, I think. And it was considered one of the finest dessert apples of the time, and it is still a really nice apple. Perhaps it wouldn't compare, let's say, to an ambrosia or whatever, but it is a really, really good one. And another one that's fairly uncommon, but I really love, is Bethel. And this was found in Vermont in the 1800s, and it has a unique flavor that. Again, I find it very hard to describe to people flavors in apples because we don't really have the vocabulary for it. When you're talking about wines, you have all of these various toasty and oaky and all this kind of stuff, but not so much for apples. But it suffice to say, it's a very, very unique apple, and that's just a few of them. I mean, in a sense, it's really hard to pick them out because every single one of them was chosen for a reason. And usually when you taste it, you understand why. Some of them, of course, were for cooking or baking. And that's a whole different thing because there you generally are looking for different characteristics. Like if you're a cooking apple, you need a fair amount of acidity. Because a very sweet apple, let's say like Tolman Sweet is a very old sweet apple, but it would not make a good pie because it would taste kind of flat. whereas something like a Bramley or Rhode Island greening has high acids as well as sugars, and so you get that briskness that the sugar balances with.
Yeah, interesting. In terms of famous, is that the same as a snow apple? Is that just a different name for the
Just a
snow
different
apple?
name. Yeah, different name.
And that has quite a long history as well, doesn't it?
That they believe it came out of Quebec in the 1600s. It was probably brought as seed from France and grown by the missionaries, from the Jesuit missionaries. And then it quickly spread southward and into Vermont, into Maritimes, Atlantic Canada, and in New England, and gradually made its way throughout sort of northeastern North America. I don't know whether it was ever grown much in the western sections. I think it does better in a cool climate. But it's it's a very old one. I know it was also called the chimney apple by people in Vermont, because at Chimney Point, they claimed that it was from there, but it actually was much later when it arrived in Vermont. So it's almost for sure it came out of Quebec. It could have been brought as a grafted tree from France, but at that time period, when it took so long to cross the Atlantic, it's very unlikely. It was probably brought as seed.
Well, we have just a few minutes left, and in a minute, we're going to find out who wins a copy of your book. But do you have a few words or suggestions for people, your top tips in growing these hardy apple trees successfully? What would you say?
I'd say first look at the soil, because the soil is everything. That's what they're eating in a sense. And so I would make sure that the acidity level is adjusted properly. Very important, the pH. And so you'd get a soil test done, and you want that soil to be between 6.5 and 7 for optimum growth in an apple. Organic matter is important as well. You want to make sure that soil can hold water and yet have aeration. And also, as organic matter breaks down, it is releasing the nutrients that are so important to the apple. Site, of course, very important. If you are in a frost pocket, you are going to be frustrated because you're going to get those cold nights and your apple blossoms will freeze. So not everyone is in a great spot to grow apples. You have to try to choose the best site that you have. I would say that sun, of course, don't try to grow them in the shade or partial shade. They need full sun. And then I would read as much as possible about pruning and why you prune, what you're trying to do with pruning, and what you really want to open it up to air and sunlight, but you don't want any blank spaces in the trees either, because a blank space does not produce fruit. So those are kind of the highlights, I think, of apple growing. You want to optimize soil, sun, and water to give it the best opportunity to produce fruit of high quality.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. So now it is almost time to discover who won a copy of your beautiful book, Bob. But first, I want to say a quick hello to some of the regular listeners who sent me emails this month. So this month I heard from Carl from Albany, New York, who sent me a really nice graphic. It shows apple sweetness. So it's a guide where it shows you here are the sweetest apples and here are the most tart apples, and you can kind of see what there is along that scale. So thank you so much, Carl. Gail wrote me celebrating the launch of apple season. Joe and Jane wrote to say hi and to tell me that they would be listening into the show today. So thank you, everybody, for being part of the Orchard People community. I really appreciate being able to enjoy sharing my passion for fruit trees with you guys. So that's wonderful. So now Gary in the studio is going to help us figure out who's won today's prize. Gary, are you there?
I am here. And Bob, you know the drill. I'm going to shake the bucket. You tell me when to stop, and I'll pull a great piece of paper out. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Here we go.
Stop.
Okay. Let's see what we got here. And I believe it's pronounced Aislinn or Aslan.
Yeah. Aislinn. Very
Aislinn,
nice.
I'm sorry.
At least that's how I think. That's how I pronounced
Yeah.
it.
So from Ontario, congratulations.
Wonderful. Aislinn, so you won today's prize, which is Bob Osborne's new book, Hardy Apples, Growing Apples in Cold Climates, valued at $35. Congratulations. So thank you so much, Bob, for being with me on the show today and for sharing some of your favorite apple varieties. If anybody wants to, get in touch with you or find out more about you, what's your website?
They just go to cornhillnursery.com.
cornhillnursery.com. So thank you for spending this time with us today.
It's been fun.
Okay, we'll see you next time. Okay.
Bye.
Bye. So if you want to learn more about today's topic, why not go over to the Orchard People YouTube channel? In the next couple of days, I'm going to upload a short video version of this podcast, and I'll include lots of images of the apples that we've talked about to bring it all to life for you. And also, if you want to listen to this show again, or if you want to download other episodes, go to orchardpeople.com/podcasts. Now, from listener Sean, I realized that people don't know that they can get more than the last, 25 podcasts. I'm going to put a button on there that says, take me to the website where you can find all the podcasts, because this is episode 86. There are lots of them. So you can learn more about growing fruit trees at orchardpeople.com/podcasts. And you can also go to orchardpeople.com, where I also have detailed articles and courses on fruit tree care. Finally, are you looking for gifts for friends or for family? Maybe you want to consider giving them a copy of one of my books. You can find both books and lots more gift ideas at orchardpeople.com/shop. Well, thank you, everybody. That's all for today's show. I hope you will join me again next month, and we're going to have another great topic. So I'll see you all then. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Urban Forestry Radio Show with your host, Susan Poizner, right here on Reality Radio 101.